You sick freak, tell them what you did with the money. My brother Caleb shouted, his hand gripping our mother's shoulder like he was holding her up at a funeral. She stole everything. Every penny. 2 federal agents had me pressed against the kitchen counter, reading me my rights, while a third one walked out of my home office with my laptop and an evidence bag. I didn't say anything. I didn't even cry. I just looked at Caleb, because 11 days ago he wasn't calling me a thief. He was on his knees in my living room asking me to co-sign a $740,000 loan to save his company. He thought he could turn his sister into the patsy for a fraud he engineered himself. He underestimated what a quiet woman with a CPA license can do when she finally stops being quiet. Stay with me because I'm going to walk you through every move I made to dismantle his lie. If you've ever been the one in your family who pays the bills and gets called selfish anyway, hit the like button and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know who's in the room with me tonight. It started 11 days before the agents knocked. I was sitting on the floor of my condo in Charlotte, North Carolina, sorting through tax documents for a client. My condo isn't fancy. It's a 1-bedroom in the Plaza Midwood neighborhood that I bought with 12 years of savings and a 40-year fixed mortgage I plan to pay off in 15. I'm 31. I run a small accounting practice out of my home office. I'm not rich. I'm careful. There's a difference my family has never been able to understand. My phone buzzed with a text from my brother. Hey, can I come by tonight? Need to talk. It's bad. I stared at the screen for a full minute before I answered. Caleb is 28, 3 years younger than me, and he hadn't come by in over a year. The last time he'd reached out, it was to ask if I could co-sign a car lease for him because his credit had tanked after he missed 7 payments on his last car. I'd said no. He'd called me a heartless witch and then asked our mum to do it instead, which she did, and which I had warned her not to do, and which had eventually destroyed her credit score too. So when he asked to come over, my whole body knew something was wrong. But I said yes. Of course I said yes. I always said yes eventually. That's the trick of being raised in a house where one kid is the prince and the other one is the wallet. He showed up at 8:30 with our mum in tow. That was the first thing that felt off. Caleb never brought mum anywhere. He used her, sure. He'd have her call me when he wanted something because he knew I'd say no faster to him than to her, but he didn't include her in his life unless he needed her face for leverage. Mom looked terrible. Her hair was flat and she was wearing the navy blue cardigan she only puts on when she's stressed. She wouldn't meet my eyes when I let them in. She just sat down on my couch and folded her hands in her lap like she was at a doctor's appointment waiting for bad news. Caleb didn't sit, he paced. He was wearing the same Patek Philippe watch he'd bought himself for his 25th birthday, the one that cost more than my car. He kept twisting it on his wrist while we talked. I'm going to lose everything, he said. The business, the house, all of it. They're calling the line of credit on Monday, and if I don't refinance by then, it's over. I'll be bankrupt by the end of the month. His business was a marketing agency in South End. He'd started it 4 years ago with seed money from our father's life insurance payout, money that was supposed to be split between the two of us, but that my mother had given entirely to him because, in her words, women don't need as much to start out. I'd let it go. I told myself I didn't need it. I built my own thing without it. But it had stung, and the sting was still there every time he flexed something new. How much do you need? I asked. I didn't want to ask. I asked anyway. 740,000. He said the number, like he was telling me the weather. There's a credit union out of Raleigh that'll do a small business expansion loan at 6.25. But my personal credit is shot from the divorce and the agency's debt to income is upside down. I need a co-signer with a clean profile, just to get it through underwriting. Then I refinance in 18 months once revenue stabilizes and you're off the paper. You won't even feel it. I told him no. I told him no 4 different ways. I told him I'd worked too hard to put my own credit and my condo and my practice at risk for a business I had no oversight of. I told him I wasn't his bank. I told him I wasn't his bank. I told him I'd help him find a bankruptcy attorney instead. I was direct. I was clear. I felt good about being clear, the way you feel good for about 30 seconds before the guilt starts. That's when my mother started crying. She didn't sob. She just sat there on my couch with tears rolling down her face. And she said, "Your father would be so disappointed. He raised us to take care of each other. Your brother is drowning and you have the rope in your hand and you're choosing to watch him drown over a piece of paper. I want you to understand something." I'd been hearing some version of that sentence my entire life. When I was 9 and Caleb broke my collarbone, shoving me off a swing set, my mom told me I was making him feel guilty for an accident. When I was 16 and he stole the cash I'd saved for a class trip out of my sock drawer, my mom told me, family doesn't keep score. When I was 24 and he wrecked my first car driving it without permission, my mum told me I had insurance and he didn't, and what mattered was that he was safe. I had been trained, the way you train a dog with a shock collar, to associate saying no with pain. Not his pain, mine. Because his pain was always converted into my pain through the alchemy of my mother's grief. So I said yes. I said yes, the way you sign a hospital release form, knowing it's bad and signing anyway because the alternative is unthinkable. I made him agree to terms. I made him put it in writing. I had him sign a side agreement that gave me visibility into the agency's books for the duration of the loan and a personal guarantee that if anything went sideways, he would liquidate his personal assets first, including the watch and the house and the Tesla. He signed it without reading it. That should have told me everything. The loan closed on a Wednesday. The funds went into the business operating account. I went home and I poured myself a glass of wine and I sat on my balcony and I felt sick, not relieved, sick, because something in my gut already knew. 11 days later, the agents came. It was a Sunday morning. I was making coffee. I had the radio on, NPR, some segment about beekeeping. The doorbell rang, and when I opened it, there were 3 men in dark windbreakers with FBI patches and a fourth person behind them, who turned out to be a forensic accountant from the Financial Crimes Division. They had a warrant. They told me I was being detained for questioning in connection with a wire fraud and money laundering investigation. They said the word $740,000, and I felt the floor tilt. They took my laptop. They took my external hard drive. They took the file box from my office that had every client tax return I'd filed in the last 7 years. They took my phone. They took the cash I keep in a coffee can in the kitchen for emergencies, $640, because they said it could be connected to the proceeds of the alleged crime. And then my brother showed up. He'd been waiting. That's what I figured out later. He'd been parked down the street with my mother in the passenger seat, waiting for the raid to be far enough along that he could perform his entrance. He came running up my walkway in basketball shorts and a hoodie like he'd just been pulled out of bed, and he grabbed onto the agent at the door and started saying, "That's her. That's my sister, please. Where's my money? What did she do with my money?" He had a story already prepared and he told it loud enough for my neighbors to hear. He'd given me his life savings to invest, he said. He trusted me because I'm his sister and a CPA. He said I'd shown him fake account statements for months. He said the loan was actually for his business and I'd convinced him it was a routine refinance and I'd siphoned the funds into accounts he didn't know about. He cried real tears. He's always been good at real tears. My mother stood on the sidewalk in her cardigan and she didn't say a word. She didn't look at me. She just watched the whole thing happen like she was watching it on television. And in that moment, I realized she had known. Maybe not the details, but she had known. She had known my brother was setting me up and she had come along on the night he asked for the cosign because her presence was part of the trap. She was the emotional pressure that got me to sign. Without her tears on my couch, I would have stayed no. I should have screamed. I should have grabbed an agent by the lapels and said, "You have to listen to me. None of this is what it looks like." But I didn't. I went quiet. The same way I went quiet when I was 9 and bleeding from my collarbone and being told I was the problem. The same way I went quiet when I was 16 and missing my trip money and being told family doesn't keep score. My body knows that silence. It folds into it like a familiar coat. People think when you're innocent you fight. They think the truth makes you loud. But the truth doesn't make you anything if you've been taught your whole life that the truth doesn't matter when it's coming out of your mouth. When everyone who's supposed to love you has spent 30 years telling you that your version of events is wrong, you stop trusting your own version. For about 10 seconds in that kitchen with the agent reading me my rights, I genuinely wondered if I had done something I didn't remember. That is what abuse does. It doesn't just hurt you. It rewires you to question whether you exist. They took me downtown in the back of an unmarked sedan. I asked for a lawyer the moment we got to the interview room. I want to be clear about that because I've watched enough true crime to know better. I said the words, "I am not answering any questions without an attorney present," and the agent across from me, a woman with tired eyes and a small silver cross on her necklace, nodded and slid a phone across the table. I called the only attorney I knew personally, a woman named Adaise, who had been 2 years ahead of me at UNC and who now practiced white-collar defense in uptown Charlotte. She was at brunch. She left her brunch. While I waited for her, I sat in that interview room and I made myself think, not feel. Think, because feeling was a luxury and I didn't have one. I was a CPA. I had spent my entire career reading numbers other people thought were hidden. And I knew, with the cold certainty of someone who balances books for a living, that my brother had not pulled this off alone. The loan was $740,000. Most of that money had moved through the business operating account in the first 72 hours after closing. I had seen the wires myself because I'd insisted on read-only access. 8 wires, all to vendors I didn't recognize, all just under the $10,000 federal reporting threshold except for 2 that were higher and had memos like equipment lease and consulting retainer. The pattern was textbook structuring. Whoever set those up knew exactly where the bank's reporting triggers were. My brother does not know that. My brother thinks structuring is something you do to a building. The person who set those wires up was a financial professional. And I knew exactly who it was. My brother's CFO, a woman named Soraya who had joined the agency 18 months earlier from a hedge fund in Atlanta. I had met her once at a Christmas party. She had asked me 3 questions about my practice, and I had walked away knowing she was the most dangerous person in that room. She watched everyone. She had the kind of stillness you only develop in environments where information is currency. I had told my brother on the drive home that night that he should run a background check on her. He had laughed and said she was the best hire he'd ever made. She wasn't his CFO. She was his partner. Maybe his lover, I didn't know yet, but she was something more than an employee. And I would have bet my license that she was the one who had built the wire structure that made it look like I was the one laundering the loan proceeds. My brother didn't have the patience or the skill to fake that. He'd have hired her to do it and promised her a cut, and now she was somewhere watching the news, waiting for him to deliver me to the prosecutors so she could collect. Adaise arrived an hour later in a tennis skirt and a blazer. She listened to me lay out the whole timeline in about 15 minutes. She did not interrupt me once. When I was done, she said 3 things. First, you did the right thing by shutting up. Second, we are going to subpoena the agency's books. Third, we are going to find this Soraya woman and we are going to flip her before he does. She was right about one thing and very wrong about another, but I didn't know that yet. The next 48 hours were the worst of my life. I wasn't charged. The agents released me late Sunday night after Adaise argued that I had no flight risk, no prior record, and a verifiable explanation for the loan paperwork bearing my name. But my laptop was gone. My client files were gone. My phone was gone. My business was effectively shut down. The local news had a story by Monday morning that didn't name me but named the agency and described a quote-unquote family member of the agency's CEO who was being investigated for embezzlement. 2 of my clients fired me by Tuesday afternoon. One of them was a dental practice that paid my mortgage 3 months a year. I sat in my condo with no laptop and no phone, and I watched my career disintegrate in real time. My mother called my landline. I didn't pick up. She left a voicemail that I listened to once and then deleted. She said she didn't know what was happening, but she was sure there had been a misunderstanding and we needed to come together as a family. She said your brother is heartbroken. She did not ask if I was okay. On Tuesday night, a Daisy called me from her car. She said one word. Soraya. It turned out Soraya had been at the federal building all afternoon. She had walked in voluntarily with her own attorney. She had not flipped on my brother out of guilt. She had flipped on him because she had read the affidavit in the case file her attorney had been allowed to review, and she had realized something I had figured out 48 hours earlier. My brother had named her in his initial statement, not as a partner, as a witness. He'd told the agents that Soraya had been the one who'd flagged my supposed embezzlement and brought it to his attention. He had positioned her as the whistleblower, which sounds noble except that whistleblowers in financial crimes cases get to post for months and often get their professional licenses pulled. He had thrown her under the bus the same way he threw me under the bus, except hers was a slower bus and she'd had time to see it coming. She had everything. She had texts where my brother described me as a, quote, stuck-up little priss who thinks she's better than us. She had a draft email he'd had her write to the loan officer pretending to be me. She had a recording of him saying, on the phone with her, that his sister was going to take the fall for the structured wires and that nobody would believe a CPA who'd, quote, signed the paperwork anyway. She had screenshots of him sending her instructions for moving $60,000 of the loan funds into a brokerage account in his ex-wife's maiden name, which is a level of cynical creativity I genuinely had not credited him with. Daisy met with the assistant U.S. attorney on Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, the investigation had pivoted entirely. By Friday, my brother was arrested at his agency's office in front of his entire staff. I know because one of his employees, a junior designer who I had met twice and who had always been kind to me, sent me a message on LinkedIn that said, I don't know what's happening, but I want you to know I never believed it. She included a photo from her phone, taken through a glass conference room wall, of my brother being walked out in cuffs. I looked at that photo for a long time. The afternoon he was arrested, my mother came to my door. She had a casserole. An actual casserole like we were in a sitcom. She set it on my kitchen counter and she started to cry and she said, honey, I didn't know. I swear to you I didn't know. Your brother lied to me too. We're both victims here. I made her sit down. I made her look at me. I asked her one question. I said, when you sat on my couch 11 days ago and cried until I signed those papers, did you know what he was actually using the money for? She said no. I knew she was lying. I knew because I had spent 31 years being a student of her face, and her face had the same expression it had worn the day I was 9 and bleeding from my collarbone. The expression that said, I see what happened and I am choosing not to see it. I told her to take her casserole and leave. I told her I was filing for a permanent restraining order and that my attorney would be in touch with any communication going forward. She tried to grab my hand and I pulled it back. She said, you can't do this to your own mother. I said, you did this to your own daughter for 30 your duel. The math is on my side. She left. I closed the door. I sat on the floor in my hallway and I cried for the first time in 11 days. Not the pretty kind of crying. The kind where your face swells and your throat hurts the next morning. I cried because I had finally done the thing I had spent my entire life being afraid to do, which was to say the actual sentence out loud to her face. And the world hadn't ended. It had just gotten quieter. My brother was charged with wire fraud, bank fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and aggravated identity theft. The identity theft charge stuck because of the draft email Soraya had written pretending to be me, which the prosecutors argued was a material part of the fraud scheme. Identity theft in federal court carries a mandatory 2-year enhancement on top of the underlying sentence. His attorney tried to argue that I had voluntarily handed over the loan paperwork and that the email had never been sent. The prosecutors had Soraya's testimony that he had ordered her to send it and that she had refused. He took a plea deal. 12 years in federal prison. No parole. just the standard 15% good behavior reduction. He'll be out when he's 39. Soraya cooperated and got 6 months in a minimum security facility and a permanent ban on holding any financial role at a federally insured institution. I think she got off light. I don't lose sleep over it. She handed me my life back. I don't have to like her to acknowledge what she did. The civil side took longer. The credit union sued my brother and his agency for the entire $740,000 because I had insisted on the side agreement giving me first lien position on his personal assets. The watch and the Tesla and the equity in his house got liquidated, and the proceeds came to me. It wasn't enough to cover everything, but it was enough to settle my portion of the loan and to fund what I did next. My mother tried to contact me twice more, once through my aunt and once through a church friend who I had liked very much and who I had to gently tell I could no longer see. The restraining order went through 6 weeks after I filed it. The judge granted it without much fight because my brother's plea deal was already a matter of public record and the family dynamic was, in her words, sufficiently documented. It's been a little over a year now. I sold the Plaza Midwood condo. Too many memories, and the news story had been picked up by a local blog and people in my neighborhood had figured out who the unnamed CPA was. I moved to Asheville. I rent a small house in West Asheville with a porch and a yard that gets afternoon sun. I rebuilt my practice from scratch. Most of my old clients came back once the charges against me were formally dropped and the local paper ran a correction. Some didn't. I let them go. With the money from the lien settlement, after paying my legal fees and replacing the equipment the FBI had taken, I had about $80,000 left over. I used it to start a nonprofit. It's small. It's just me and a part-time bookkeeper and a board of 3 women I trust. We provide free financial forensic services to people who suspect they've been the victim of family financial abuse. Caressed co-signing, identity theft by a relative, inheritance fraud, the kind of thing nobody talks about at Thanksgiving because everyone is too embarrassed, and the police don't always know what to do with it. We've taken on 47 cases in our first 9 months. I am busier than I have ever been in my life, and I sleep better than I have ever slept. I want to tell you what I learned, but I don't want to sound like a therapist. I'm not. I'm just a woman who finally said no. If you grew up as the responsible one, the one who got called selfish for having boundaries, the one whose savings account was treated like a family resource, I want you to hear this. Your silence in the moment they came for you was not weakness. It was a body that had been trained for a very long time to make itself small for safety. There is nothing wrong with you. The training was the problem, and the people who trained you were the problem, and the system in your family that rewarded their behavior was the problem. You are not the problem. You never were. I am 32 now. I live alone in a house with a porch. I have a cat named Pickles who I adopted from a shelter outside Hendersonville. I am dating a high school teacher named Jonas who has never once asked me for money and who, when I told him this story on our 4th date, just held my hand and said, "Your brother is a coward and your mother is a coward and you are not." I cried a little. He pretended not to notice. I'm going to marry him eventually. I haven't told him yet. If this story landed somewhere in your chest, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and tell me one thing you said no to this week, even a small one. Especially a small one. Those are the ones that count. I've thought a lot about how a person ends up sitting on the floor of her own hallway at 31 years old, finally crying about something that started when she was 9. The answer isn't dramatic, it's just math. Every time I said yes when I meant no, I was making a small deposit into an account that my brother and my mother were both withdrawing from. For 30 years, the account never went empty because I kept refilling it with my time, my money, my labor, my silence. And then one Wednesday, I signed a piece of paper for $740,000, and the account overdrew, and the bank that was my body sent the notice. What happened to Caleb wasn't bad luck. It was the natural consequence of a man who had been told his whole life that other people would clean up after him. He built a business on borrowed credibility. He hired a CFO smarter than himself, and he assumed his sister would absorb the fallout because she always had. He miscalculated exactly one variable, which was Soraya. He thought she was loyal. She wasn't. She was watching. People who get used the way she got used eventually learn the same lesson I did, just on a faster timeline. The universe didn't punish him. He punished himself by being a man who used everyone around him as an exit strategy. And exits only work until the people you were using realize they have doors of their own. What happened to my mother wasn't bad luck either. She had spent 3 decades teaching me that love was something I earned by being useful, and she was genuinely surprised the day I cashed in the lesson and told her she had not earned mine. That casserole on my counter is the saddest object I have ever seen, because it was her best attempt at fixing something with the only tool she had, and the tool didn't work anymore. I want to tell you what I think I know now. I don't think being a good person means being available to everyone who claims a relationship with you. I think being a good person means being honest, especially when honesty is expensive. I had a kind of intelligence my whole life that I was using on tax returns and never using on my own life. And the moment I turned it inward, the whole architecture changed. The strength I needed wasn't dramatic strength. It wasn't the kind of strength that fights an FBI agent. It was the quieter kind, the kind that lets you sit in a hallway and cry and not pick up the phone when your mother calls. That kind of strength is built one small no at a time, in private, when nobody is watching and nobody will applaud. If you're sitting somewhere tonight feeling like the wallet in your own family, I want you to know 2 things. The math is real, and it's already on your side. You just have to be brave enough to count.